Well, as I said, we are in the second week of this series, Emotionally Healthy Spirituality. And I have tried to bring myself to say EHS because it's just easier to say, but I feel like I need to say the whole thing. And last week we saw with really just kind of the intro that the premise of this series is that it is impossible to be or become spiritually mature while remaining emotionally immature. Those two things go hand in hand, and that's really what we're discovering and talking about in this series. The question is, what does it look like to be spiritually and emotionally healthy and mature? So the first question we really need to deal with is to know what the difference is there. So that's the question that we have to address. What's the difference between emotionally healthy and unhealthy spirituality? Well, there's a character in the Old Testament whose life we're going to look at this morning, whose life vividly illustrates what unhealthy and immature spirituality and emotions, I guess is how you say that, look like. And that's King Saul. If you know anything about the life of King Saul, you already know that he had some pretty major hang-ups. His life was not what you would call spiritually healthy or even emotionally healthy, especially as we look at one episode in his life, and that's where we're going to be this morning, 1 Samuel 15. And I'm going to make up for all the scripture that I didn't read last week. We're going to make up for it this morning. We're going to read 23 verses from 1 Samuel chapter 15. It begins at verse 1. One day Samuel said to Saul, "It was the Lord who told me to anoint you as king of his people Israel. Now listen to this message from the Lord. This is what the Lord of heaven's armies has declared. I have decided to settle accounts with the nation of Amalek for opposing Israel when they came from Egypt. Now go and completely destroy the entire Amalekite nation, men, women, children, babies, cattle, sheep, goats, camels, and donkeys." So Saul mobilized his army at Telem. There were 200,000 soldiers from Israel and 10,000 men from Judah. Then Saul and his army went to a town of the Amalekites and lay in wait in the valley. Saul sent this warning to the Kenites: "Move away from where the Amalekites live, or you will die with them. For you showed kindness to all the people of Israel when they came up from Egypt." So the Kenites packed up and left. Then Saul slaughtered the Amalekites from Havilah all the way to Shur, east of Egypt. He captured Agag, the Amalekite king, but completely destroyed everything else. Saul and his men spared Agag's life and kept the best of the sheep and goats, the cattle, the fat calves, the lambs, everything, in fact, that appealed to them. They destroyed only what was worthless or of poor quality. Then the Lord said to Samuel, "I am sorry that I ever made Saul king, for he has not been loyal to me, and he has refused to obey my command." Samuel was so deeply moved when he heard this that he cried out to the Lord all night. Early the next morning, Samuel went to find Saul. Someone told him Saul went to the town of Carmel to set up a monument to himself. Then he went on to Gilgal. When Samuel finally found him, Saul greeted him cheerfully. "May the Lord bless you," he said. "I have carried out the Lord's command." "Then what is all the bleating of sheep and goats and the lowing of cattle I hear?" Samuel demanded. "It's true that the army spared the best of the sheep, goats, and cattle," Saul admitted, "but they are going to sacrifice them to the Lord your God. We have destroyed everything else." Then Samuel said to Saul, "Stop. Listen to what the Lord told me last night." "What did he tell you?" Saul asked. And Samuel told him, "Although you may think little of yourself, are you not the leader of the tribes of Israel? The Lord has anointed you king of Israel. And the Lord sent you on a mission and told you, 'Go and completely destroy the sinners, the Amalekites, until they are all dead.' Why haven't you obeyed the Lord? Why did you rush for the plunder and do what was evil in the Lord's sight?" "But I did obey the Lord," Saul insisted. "I carried out the mission he gave me. I brought back King Agag, but I destroyed everyone else. Then my troops brought in the best of the sheep, goats, cattle, and plunder to sacrifice to the Lord your God in Gilgal. But Samuel replied, what is more pleasing to the Lord, your burnt offerings and sacrifices, or your obedience to his voice? Listen, obedience is better than sacrifice, and submission is better than offering the fat of rams. Rebellion is as sinful as witchcraft, and stubbornness as bad as worshiping idols. So because you have rejected the command of the Lord, he has rejected you as king. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Well, we're not going to dive real deep into the story, but I share it as an illustration, and you can reflect on this over this coming week, of how spiritual unhealth can bring destruction and devastation. Saul's problem, especially in this particular situation, and we see it over and over again in all of his various foibles, was partial obedience. He was unwilling in this story to destroy everything that God had told him to destroy. In fact, there's an interesting statement there in the story that he and the army kept all of the things that pleased them. And then when Samuel comes to confront him about it, he has the audacity to say, oh, well, yes, I carried out the command of the Lord. I did everything that he told me to do. Now, what's interesting is that I think Saul probably did believe that he had done everything that God had told him to do. He had reasoned somehow in his mind that, yes, I have obeyed what God had told me to do. Which really leads us to this deeper problem that was going on in Saul's life. His ultimate problem was that he had a shallow spirituality. He had only let God deal with the surface issues in his life. He had never given him access to all of these deep inner places. And we see that in the fact that his life was driven by fear and insecurity and jealousy. You just think of all of the times that he tried to get David. Why did he try? He was jealous of him. He was insecure. He kept his relationship with God at a surface level, and therefore he had a shallow spirituality. Unfortunately, Saul's life reflects the relationship that too many believers have with God. There are things in their lives that they know that God has called them to destroy or get rid of, attitudes, behaviors, thought patterns, secret sins, and for whatever reason, they've been unwilling to do so, or they've only been willing to do so up to a point. The Holy Spirit has only had access to those surface issues in their lives. He's never been allowed to go deeper into the real issues that are keeping them from real growth and real maturity. It's a shallow spirituality that's leading to disaster, and they probably don't see it. And when people challenge their behavior, they challenge their attitudes, they say things like, well, that's just how I am. But if we are to grow emotionally and spiritually mature and healthy, we need to deal or let God deal with all of those things that are deep down inside of us instead of expecting everyone else to deal with it. I want to bring back this picture that we looked at last week, this picture of the iceberg. And you remember we talked about how our lives are very much like this iceberg. They are 80% below the surface, 20% above the surface. When we don't let God deal with that 80% that's below the surface, we may have a form of spirituality, but it will be a shallow one that will have no power, and we will spend all of our time and we will burn all of our energy just trying to keep the 20% of that looking pretty. We need a spirituality that goes deep and deals with the stuff that's lurking below the surface. And we all know that it lurks below the surface. But before we kind of get to a solution to that, with that problem of shallow spirituality and why it seems to be just so prevalent in the church, we need to understand what this whole thing of unhealthy spirituality looks like. So this morning, what I want to do is I want to take a look at 3 causes in the church that we need to kind of address and at least be aware of as we move forward, that are really the causes of the shallow spirituality that we see. And the first one is this, and this is something that we really as a church, and I'm not just talking about our local congregation, I think the church as a whole needs to own up to this, is that we have tolerated emotional immaturity in the church. We've tolerated it. And things that you tolerate, eventually you will come to accept. You might not say that, but that's what we have done. I think for too long, if we are honest, we have tolerated and failed to deal with just bad behavior, bad attitudes. We have allowed people to hold on to those things, to those patterns of behavior that have not been emotionally mature or spiritually healthy, not just for them, but for the church as a whole. Here's just a couple of examples of what this looks like. You have someone who's gifted and talented publicly, but they treat their spouse like garbage. They are nice at church, but they treat the rest of their family poorly. They fast and pray regularly, but they are critical, judgmental, and unloving toward other people, and they like to call it spiritual discernment. People who get their feelings hurt and either don't say anything at all and just let it fester, or just snap. People who portray themselves as holy in public, but they live with a secret sin. That's just a sampling of what this looks like. The question is, why have we allowed this to persist and continue? And the answer is easy. At least for a season, it's easier to just not deal with it. It's easier to just hope it will go away. And we don't want to confront people's behavior. We don't want to confront those attitudes because we don't want to offend them, or worse, possibly lose them. Or to make it more personal, we don't want our own attitudes and thought patterns exposed and considered and dealt with. Now, there's all sorts of reasons why this takes place. It could be that it's just stubbornness like Saul had. Saul was just a stubborn person. He didn't want to change. He didn't show any indication that he wanted to change. Or maybe it's that we've come to think that we have to put on this front that we're these well put together Christians all the time who never have any struggles. We've never been told that we're allowed. I mean, we just talked about this. Bring your brokenness and put it on the altar. We've been taught, especially in the great place that we live in America, that you need to buck up, you need to power through, you need to pray harder, read more scripture. And that's all good. But when we don't deal and acknowledge with all of those emotions that just, the things that make us tick, that cause us to respond in certain ways, then we end up with this shallow spirituality, and our behavior and our attitudes, they go unchecked and they go on, we just tolerate them. And as a result of that, there are all sorts of people in the church who have just stuffed down their emotions to the point where they are emotionally numb. They don't feel anything, which is bad. And it's well-intentioned because we don't want to feel bad things. But when you become numb and you can't feel bad emotions, you know what else you can't feel? Good ones. Which makes it very hard to give and receive love, which is one of the hallmark traits, if not the hallmark trait, of being a Christian. When we ignore our emotions, when I'm talking about emotions, I'm talking about those really deep-seated parts of who we are. The things that really make us tick. When we don't deal with those, when we ignore those, we do it to our own detriment. And we remain emotional infants, and you see it happen all the time. And Saul is a prime example, maybe an extreme example of how this works itself and plays itself out. He had a shallow spirituality. He had a public life with God, but he did not have a private life with God. For the most part, he was allowed to get away with that. He was allowed to get away with his emotional immaturity, his behavior, and his petty jealousy. Do you know why? Well, I can understand why Saul was allowed to get away with it, because I would imagine anybody who would have confronted the king on that would not have left that encounter upright. So think about us today. You know, why don't we address this in each other? And I'm sure that most of us, we'll never encounter a situation where when we go in to confront someone, we're going in with our life on the line, but why don't we? I mean, it's something I know that makes all of us uncomfortable. We haven't even really done it, and I am thinking of my own bad attitudes that tend to creep up. It's just something that makes us uncomfortable talking about and thinking about. But I think it's for the same reason, but not on the same level. We're afraid we'll lose a friend. We're afraid we're going to be misunderstood, that we will hurt feelings. Or on the flip side, when we're confronted about it, we become defensive or we clam up, which just proves the point because we respond in a way that's emotionally immature. Proverbs 27:6 says, "Wounds from a sincere friend are better than many kisses from an enemy." Aren't we supposed to be calling each other to a higher ground in our relationships with Jesus? Aren't we supposed to be encouraging each other to grow and gently and lovingly and graciously pointing out some of those things in our lives that are hindering that growth, while at the same time being willing to receive the same kind of loving, gracious, and gentle direction from others? But a lot of times what happens is we'll see something in somebody's life and we'll just think, man, it's none of my business. Or, again, to flip it, somebody will try to point something out in our life and you'll go, you're right, that is none of your business. Cain tried to get away with that. God comes looking for Abel and he asks Cain where his brother is. And Cain says, "Am I my brother's keeper? I think not." And God says, "Oh, yeah, you are." I think he would say the same thing to many of us. But here's important, and this is an important thing to understand. You don't just go around correcting anybody and everybody. I think that's the flip side of the error that we have made. Correction, especially in a biblical context, is done in a loving context, the context of a loving relationship with discernment, covered by a lot of prayer. The context for giving and receiving loving correction is an established relationship between like-hearted people. There must be relational capital invested beforehand. So my question is there someone in your life that God may be wanting, you sense God might be wanting me to address something in someone else's life, and you're giving them a pass? Or is there something in your life that somebody has been trying to address, or God has been using somebody to address, that you're trying to let yourself get a pass on? Love does not ignore issues. Love is not blind. You can look all you want to in 1 Corinthians 13, and you will not find that sentence. Love is not blind, contrary to popular opinion. It does believe and hope for the best, but it is not blind to reality. You might be able to find that sentence. That was an overstatement. You might not find that sentence in the way that it's usually used. Love does not ignore the reality of what's going on. So that's the first reason for a shallow Christianity we have today, is that we have tolerated it and the immaturity that it perpetuates. The second reason is this: we have emphasized doing for God over being with God. I think one of the greatest challenges in the Christian life is balancing those two things, being with God and doing for Him. I think a lot of us are in a perpetual state of busyness and hurry. Our lives are overbooked, we're overextended, and for a lot of people, their drug of choice is adrenaline. We fear that if we slow down or we stop, everything is going to fall apart. So we live at breakneck speed and we never slow down. But here's the thing: churchy productivity does not equal spiritual maturity. God's goal for us is not for us to get as busy as we can. His goal for us, as Paul tells us, and we've talked about this often, this is a drum we beat a lot around here. His goal for us is that we grow into maturity. Productivity, all of the things that we do in the church, it does not equal spiritual maturity. And it can actually be counterproductive if it doesn't lead us to spiritual maturity. Endless doing can become a burden that leaves us irritable, resentful, and will ultimately burn us out. The very thing in our busy schedules that we eliminate is the one thing that we desperately need the most: being with Jesus. The journey to emotional and spiritual health means that we make time, not just try to find it somewhere. We carve out time to be with Jesus before we do for Him. When we aren't spending time with Jesus, we are trying to operate on an empty tank. And you cannot run on and you cannot give other people what you do not possess. If Jesus is to be the source of who we are and what we do, if He is to be the one thing that we take and give to other people, and our Jesus take is empty, we have nothing to run on, we have nothing to offer other people except for what we can produce on our own. And I know that we all know, we've all experienced this, we know that that's not going to cut it. You might be good, but you're not that good. Most of us don't spend the kind of time being with Jesus and developing a deep relationship with Him that we need to. We should fall more and more and more in love with Jesus. And we can't do that unless we are spending time with Him. The ripple effect of not doing that is spiritual immaturity and a life that is in constant disarray. If we're not letting Him deal with the spiritual stuff in our lives, we're definitely not letting Him deal with all of those deep down emotional things. Service for God that is not nourished by a deep interior life with God will eventually cause us and everything around us to crumble, just like it did for Saul. The third cause of a shallow spirituality is this: our definition of success has been all wrong. The popular mantra of our culture is bigger is better. More is better. Bigger bank accounts, greater platforms and influence, more power, a bigger house, a bigger budget, a bigger church, because bigger's better, right? In the corporate world, if you're not growing or getting bigger, then you're failing. So why are we surprised when the church picks up on this over the last 50 years or so, that the emphasis has been on getting bigger and bigger? We've come to measure success by how many people attend services, attend activities, small groups, etc. If the numbers increase, you're successful. If the numbers aren't increasing or heaven forbid, even decreasing, you're failing. Now hear me. I'm a pastor, so some of you may be hearing, yeah, but you really you like numbers. Well, yes, it's not. Numbers are not a bad thing. But if that is the only metric we are using, if that's the only measure of success, then we're missing something. We're completely missing the point. It becomes a problem when that's the only thing we measure. We need a different measure of success. We need a different metric. And what we are starting to learn, as we can call it, I'm going to call it post-COVID, is that large numbers in a church don't necessarily equal maturity and spiritual health. There are churches that have grown in the aftermath, but for many churches, the storms and everything that cropped up over that period of a couple of years really just revealed all of the unhealth that was under the surface. So if we need a different definition of success, if we need a better one, what's a good definition of success? Well, let me give you a biblical one. And this is going to be up here for a while, so you have plenty of time to write it down. Biblical success is becoming the person that God calls you to become and doing what God calls you to do in His way and according to His timetable. If you've got 500 people and 499 of them, that's not anywhere what they look like, people who are pursuing that, I would say that's not successful. If you've got 40 people and 30 of them are pursuing this, that's success. And I think the last two things in that definition, those are killers. Doing those things in God's way according to His timetable. It is entirely possible for a church to be growing numerically and failing spiritually. It's also entirely possible for your numbers to appear as if they're declining, and yet you are succeeding spiritually. I mean, look at the ministry of Jesus. You realize Jesus very rarely had large numbers. Now, He drew large crowds. But the minute He opened His mouth, you know what happened to those crowds? One story says everybody left because they didn't like what He had to say. He never had large numbers in terms of those who were fully devoted to Him in His ministry. They hated what He said. We see this kind of also in the ministry of John the Baptist. In Matthew 11, Jesus describes John. It said, of all people who have been born, there has been none greater than John the Baptist. Now, he does go on to say that the least in the kingdom of God is even greater than John. But the fact that he talks about John this way says something. And I find it to be a fascinating statement because John is a fascinating character. John was the complete opposite of anything, especially today, that we would define or call successful. And Jesus said he was the greatest. He began his ministry in the wilderness, not Jerusalem, where all the action was. He ate and he dressed weirdly, oddly. He looked funny, he smelled funny. In contrast to the religious leaders who were educated and wealthy and well-connected and had power, John was not any of those things. But here's the thing. He didn't care. Do you know why he didn't care? Because he had a very different definition of success than all of those people had. He succeeded because he became who God called and created him to be, and he did it according to God's plan and God's timeline for him. He wasn't out to impress people. He didn't preach to build crowds. He wasn't out to gain the approval of men. And he was very clear about who he was and who he was not. As a result, John had a powerful presence and authority everywhere he went. John's ministry only lasted 2 years and ended rather unceremoniously when his head was taken off by the... Yeah, we won't even get into that. For John, success was summed up in maybe one of his most famous statements ever. I must decrease, he must increase. John wasn't going to disappear. I think sometimes we think of that. No, what he meant was, I know I'm only going to become who God has called me and created me to be as I let him increase in my life and do all of the things that he needs to do in the way that he wants to do them, in the timing that he wants to do them in. For John, that was success. He would not be considered successful in today's world or in the church. Neither would prophets like Jeremiah, Isaiah, Ezekiel, Habakkuk, Amos, even Jesus. I mean, Jesus was killed for his ministry. What am I saying? When we define success wrong, all of our best energies and resources go to the wrong things. You know, discipleship is not an appealing, we like to talk about it, but really when we get down to it, it's not an appealing thing because it's slow. It's not, it takes a long time, and sometimes it's hard to measure the results. They aren't always glamorous. It's more appealing and sometimes easier to get the big show and to take care of the 20% that's above the surface. Is it possible that we have been measuring the wrong things, not just in the church, but in our own lives when it comes to success? And a second question is, if that's the case, then how does Jesus define success? What does God say success is? I think we look at other Christians, and a lot of times we immediately measure success outwardly by how it looks like they've got everything together, how that 20% on the outside looks. How it looks like God has blessed them by all the gifts they have and talents they have. And when we define success that way, if you can just look pretty on the outside, that's when we end up with this shallow spirituality and this shallow Christianity. We've measured our success by possessions attained, influence gained, and achievements instead of measuring it by our character and how well we love other people and how well we love God and spend time with him. The church culture that we have built, especially in the West, it needs to change. It needs to be willing to deal with the hard stuff, to ask the difficult questions. It needs to change to an emotionally healthy spirituality, or more and more people, we're going to hear stories of ending up just like Saul. Oh yeah, I obeyed God. Then what is all of this bleating of sheep that I hear? Did you really? So my question for us this morning is, as we prepare to pray is based on what we've talked about. How healthy is your spirituality? How healthy is our spirituality? How is it contributing to your growth in loving Jesus and loving others? How willing is it to go deep beneath the surface into that 80%? How is it increasing your maturity emotionally, spiritually, relationally, vocationally? Is your spirituality an emotionally healthy one? Bow your heads with me, please.